Professor Ken Gemes.
Hello everyone, and Johannes.
It's a pleasure and honor to be with you in your little shed.
Meine Hütte.
Deine Hütte, Ihre Hütte, I should be more formal. And well, I'd like to begin with you also, at your beginning, how you got into philosophy, before we then discuss a bit of Nietzsche perhaps, and what Nietzsche has meant for you, and also where you some of the things that I learned from you when it comes to Nietzsche. So, but I think you didn't start out with Nietzsche though.
No. I was born in Australia to war refugees from Hungary.
Yes.
And growing up in Australia was very strange. In fact, I think I published somewhere saying it was the strangest place I've ever lived in. And it was very surreal to me because, I had my parents who talked about my dad surviving this camp and all these survival stories. Also, they talk about their intellectual life, reading people like Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse, and that's the kind of books they try to get me to read, especially my dad when I was very young.
Yeah.
And juxtaposed against that with this Australian world where all people want to do is play sports. They were totally anti-intellectual. And I just couldn't put the two worlds together. And, I use this image from The Twilight Zone, a series that you probably don't know about, but it was very big when I was young, Rod Serling, black and white. And it was something, Australia felt like The Twilight Zone, because I just couldn't put together the world my parents talked about and the world of the Australians, which was just so anti-intellectual. And so that always made me very, very reflective. And I knew I was inclined towards philosophy from a fairly young age.
Yeah.
It's a story, again, I've probably told this story elsewhere.
Yeah.
But a few years ago, some guy emailed me and asked me if I'd become a philosopher. And I said yes. And he said, well, you probably don't remember me, but we're in high school. And I would have been around 15 at the time. And apparently I got caught out by some history teacher for not knowing my facts. And I said to the history teacher, well, when I grow up, I'm not going to need to know any facts because I'm going to be a philosopher. And philosophers don't need to know facts. Very naive idea of what philosophy was. So apparently from a very young age, I knew I wanted to be a philosopher. And the philosophers I read, I thought philosophy was people like Thomas Mann and Freud and Nietzsche, the kind of stuff my parents got me to read.
Yeah.
But by 16, I was already reading Wittgenstein, and I was doing these adult education courses with a bunch of other schoolboys from Sydney, and we'd go to these classes, and there were classes on Wittgenstein, on Russell. So I did that kind of stuff. But basically, I was just struck by the unreality of things because of this clash of the worlds of my parents as Hungarian Jewish war refugees and the worlds of the Australians who were, Australia was a very rich country. It was, there was Norway because of oil, I guess. There was Switzerland because of banking, and there was Australia because of all these farming and bauxite and natural products, farming products, mining products. It was a very, very rich but incredibly materialistic, anti-intellectual world. And that world and my parents' world just clashed, seemed surreal to me. So that was my beginnings in philosophy. So I knew I wanted to do philosophy, and I went straight to philosophy from high school. In Australia, it's not like in England where you just study one subject. You had to study 4 subjects, but I knew very much I wanted to major in philosophy, which is what I did.
With the focus on analytical philosophy at the time, and logical positivism. Was it Quine at the time?
I was very interested. You've got a good memory. I was very interested in Quine.
Yeah.
I like technical philosophy.
Yeah.
And I like technical philosophy because I like logic. Because with logic, if you prove a theorem, it's yours for life. And the other philosophy seemed a bit speculative. Also, I turned very much against off psychology at a certain point because I'd read a ton of Freud, I realized reading Freud made me fairly miserable because
Why?
because you analyzed everyone's motivation, including your own, and
Yeah.
it was never a pretty story. So it's reductionist, but whatever. As a kid, I kind of was very taken with Freud. My
Yeah.
parents got me to read Freud, and actually, my mum actually took my Freud away from me once because once
There was no Freud in.
they had a dinner party,
Yeah.
and someone said something, and I gave an analysis of why they said it in that manner.
Yeah.
And my mum was furious. And after this dinner, she went into my room and took all my Freud out of the room. I stole them back later on.
How does that tell us about the relationship in a Freudian sense?
With my mum?
Yeah.
I don't believe
Sorry.
I read him, I don't believe him.
Yeah. But he takes a lot from Nietzsche, obviously.
Yeah,
So-
I read Nietzsche, I don't believe him.
Yeah.
How one genius borrows from another genius is a question
Yeah.
we shouldn't go into too much.
Yeah.
There are these reductionist readings of Freud saying, oh, look, he got the notion of
Yes.
oppression from Nietzsche. And it's true he read Nietzsche and then he tried to cover it up, etc. But, one genius reads another genius, and that's just the anxiety of influence.
So you would count Nietzsche amongst the geniuses, as he would
Oh,
count himself.
absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
Just because you're a genius doesn't mean you're getting anything right. It's just
Yeah.
that genius are people who are unbelievably creative. That goes for Messi, who's a football genius, and it goes for Freud, who's a psychological genius, and Nietzsche, who's a philosophy genius.
Maybe say a bit more your understanding of genius then. That'd be interesting.
I think a genius is
Yeah.
someone who's freakily talented at something.
Yeah.
That's why I'm willing to say Messi is a football genius, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think Freud is freakily talented at psychology. I think Nietzsche's freakily talented at both psychology and philosophy. When they go beyond the norm in an exceptionally creative way.
Yeah.
And all of those three, and the three I bothered to name, not that there are many others, Descartes counts as a genius, but Messi counts as a genius too.
Do you think just to you, what do you think is more important, being correct, proving a theorem that's correct, or
No, being creative.
being creative?
Being creative is much more important than being correct.
Yeah.
Truth's a dime a dozen. Most of them are extremely boring. There's a desk here. True but boring. Most truths are boring. Truth. Aiming at the truth is a virtue.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And while I think Freud is brilliant and ingenious and incredibly creative, I wonder about the truth, and I don't count that as a virtue of his that it might not be true. It might be a failing. What I always say about Freud is he's epistemologically infirm. What he says could be the literal truth. It could all be just, as Germans would say, Luft, just hot air.
Yeah.
It's just that we have no way of proving it one way or the other because we don't know how to test those kinds of theories. But they're still incredibly interesting, but it would be better if they were interesting and true, sure.
Is the Übermensch a genius in the Nietzschean sense then? Because we are now talking about the will to truth, or rather maybe the will to untruth for Nietzsche, and I want to understand whether or not perhaps it's what's more important. This is simplifying it. Is myth not more important than logos? Let's put it in those terms, or story, narrative. What are the lies you tell yourself, perhaps even more important than...
To me or to Nietzsche?
Well, it depends.
On the Übermensch, Nietzsche says very little about the Übermensch, but the point about the Übermensch is, Nietzsche is a guy who's continually saying, I don't care about being, I care about becoming. I think all this valorization of being is a kind of what Freud would call a death wish, and Nietzsche himself calls it a death wish. I care about becoming because that's endless change, right?
Yeah.
Now, could there be a point, the Übermensch, which is actually a stopping point? How un-Nietzschean is that? He says very little about the Übermensch.
Yes.
The reason he talks about the Übermensch is because he wants to aim for something beyond ourselves.
Yes.
So it's what he cares is to strive to get beyond yourself. And if the Übermensch was ever achieved, then you'd want the Übermensch. That wouldn't be a stopping point. So the Übermensch is just a horizon he gives us. But it's moving towards the horizon that he really cares about. Now, as for what you said about myth, I agree with Nietzsche that myth is important to our to the narratives we give ourselves. You know, mythologies are to use Weber's term, what allows us to enchant the world. And what Nietzsche is so clever at pointing out is that our will to truth can lead to, we take away all permission for ourselves to live in myth, and by doing that we disenchant the world. And that's a big price to pay, to live in a disenchanted world. It's kind of a flat world, an ugly world.
It's the world of the last man, would you say?
Yeah, the last man is pretty demythologized, you know, because the last man is someone who just, he still has meaning, you know.
Yeah.
He cares about his corner office, his good meal, his career and his family. But as for the whole schmear having meaning, a whole existence, fuck that. You can look for meaning if you want. I don't care about that. And so he lives in a disenchanted world.
Yeah.
Enchantment is when you aim for existential meaning, the way religion does, or Marxism does.
In what sense do you think does Nietzsche look for meaning? Does he look for meaning purely in existentialist terms, or is it on a broader scale? Is it something that's more?
Well, I kind of agree with Andrew Huddleston. Yeah. He believes in this, you know, romantic myth of the great and creative individual, of which he is one according to his own lights.
Yeah.
But he also, this is what Huddleston says, he also cares about high culture. But high culture might be a religion shared by the genii, so to speak. And, you know, we lesser mortals can participate in it as a spectator sport, like we watch Messi. We watch high culture.
Oh,
we watch the Goethes. We can contribute footnotes to it. Footnotes are important. You need footnotes. But, you know, he sees himself and Schopenhauer and Plato and Socrates and Aristotle as making the big moves. And then other guys there, they can do, they're mapping the highways and we're doing some of the minor roads. We're writing the footnotes.
Yeah, so they're necessary mass.
Yes, I think they're necessary because they help keep the ideas alive, so to speak.
Yeah.
But they're not ends in themselves. That's what he says about scholars. They're all very useful in scribbling away and doing the minor roads or the footnotes, etc. I like McDowell's metaphor. McDowell's metaphor is the space of reasons. Well, I got to say, he got that from Sellers, right?
Yeah.
And kind of Sellers attributes it to Wittgenstein to a certain extent. There's a space of reasons. You know, Wittgenstein says the world is the totality of facts, not things. Facts are propositional. Okay, propositions are in the space of reasons.
Yeah.
So the way I like to think of it is the space of reasons. People like Kant, Descartes, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Plato, whatever, they map out whole new sections of the space of reasons. People like myself, you know, we do a few little minor roads here and there. But, you know, one does what one can.
So you've lived two lives, two souls in your chest, as it were, as an analytical philosopher of the positivistic tradition, more or less, who then came back to Nietzsche later in life. And so, on the one hand, the focus on what can be proven, what is factual, what is a theorem that can be at least proven within itself, and the creative genius aspect of Nietzsche.
As I mentioned before, I got kind of sick of all this psychological speculation about my own and other people's motivations, which always seemed very dark. And so I said I wanted to do something nothing to do with humans, nothing to do with flesh and blood.
Pure thinking.
That's why I did logic.
Yeah.
I did logic and philosophy of science because it was kind of devoid of any shred of anything to do with flesh and blood humans.
Yeah.
But as I say, if you proved the theorem, it was yours for life. And look, it was really, I mean, I kept up a bit. I still read literature. I'd occasionally read a bit of Nietzsche. But it was actually only after my son was born, Alex, my son, is severely disabled. And it was an incredible shock to me. I mean, I'd led a pretty charmed life till then. Yeah. And after that, I was just too hurt and too much in pain to live in a rarefied world of abstract thinking. I had to deal with something that actually spoke about human problems. And so I went back to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is asking big questions about, you know, what it is to be human, what should our purpose be, how can we have meaning in a world of today. So after I did that technical stuff, after I was just too much in pain to do something totally devoid of any humanity. Sorry, a bit personal, probably too much information, but it's the truth.
Experience of suffering,
Yeah.
unnecessary suffering.
Yeah, and it's a topic that's big to Nietzsche, of course.
Yes.
Nietzsche is endlessly trying to justify the suffering of the world. And he has an interesting answer, of course, contra Schopenhauer.
Yes, maybe you could, as they say, flesh that out a bit, because there is the cartoon version of Nietzsche, which would perhaps paint Nietzsche as in favor of the blonde beast, or the strong-willed individual that simply takes
No, it's
whichever
not-
he
yeah.
or she can take from the weaker or the lesser ones. But I think that while there are passages that suggest that, there is also the dimension of suffering, of deep suffering and appreciation of suffering, which again we should also maybe complicate even further with his this regard for compassion or pity. But maybe stay with suffering first.
We'll start with suffering, compassion, Mitleid in German,
Yeah.
which can be pity or compassion.
Or suffering with.
Yeah.
So
Mit
Tense.
and Leid.
yeah. Oder mit.
Suffering with. So Schopenhauer, as a lot of people know, was obsessed with the problem of suffering, and he said because the world is irredeemably full of suffering, the world ought not to be. You know, the famous wisdom of Silenus, that the best thing would have never to be born, and the second best would be to die as soon as possible. And Schopenhauer endorsed the wisdom of Silenus because he thought there was this surfeit of suffering. We got this metaphysics of the will, but we can hide all that off because it's crazy metaphysics. And the problem is there, even if we don't accept his metaphysics. And Nietzsche didn't accept the metaphysics in the end, but he did accept Schopenhauer's point that the world is full of suffering.
Yeah.
And the great move he makes, and a very clever move, is to say, look, I'm not just denying Schopenhauer's descriptive claim that the world is full of suffering, but that doesn't mean we have to jump to the conclusion the world ought not to be. You only get that conclusion if you've got an implicit premise of hedonism, that all that valuable is a surfeit of pleasure over pain, pleasure over suffering. But Nietzsche says, why should we accept that? Nietzsche says there are many other things that are valuable. For instance, creativity, which we've been talking about previously. He said, what counts is things like beauty, like creativity, great works of art, great works of culture.
Yeah.
And so why should we give all this emphasis to suffering? Because we can say, yes, the world is full of suffering, but the world can nevertheless be affirmed because it's full of these beautiful things. And a point he makes that's quite interesting is he says, in fact, to create these beautiful things often involves taking up serious challenges, like trying to write, trying to do philosophy, and those challenges can often involve a certain kind of at least mental, if not physical suffering, because you'll often fail. Most of us fail at doing good philosophy. I mean, there are the Kants and the Descartes, but the rest of us are nowhere near that. And we're basically suffering because we see the distance between them and us, but we keep trying, and we do our bit. So Nietzsche answers Schopenhauer by saying, why all the emphasis on sufferings? Yes, suffering is there, but there are other vectors of value besides, say, pleasure, right? Like creativity. And I kind of side with him on that. On the business about power, part of that's to shock his audience, but part of it also is what he really wants to emphasize, the cleverer part of him, is power over oneself. Yes. Because to create involves kind of taking control of yourself. He's also got this absurd, I find it absurd, it's a romantic idea that people who are wildly creative have a certain kind of inner unity, and the creativity is an expression of that unity. And to get that unity involves taking different parts of yourselves and mastering it, having power of them and fashioning it into a whole. Why I'm not sympathetic with is I just don't see that greatly creative people are unified. Right? I just don't see the evidence for that. Some are, you know. So this is just something he borrowed from the German Romantics. In German we say Einheit, unity. He's an Einheit lover, and it's pretty ungrounded. I'm not sympathetic to that at all.
Einheit, unity, which we've discussed previously also, with the master drive leading.
Yeah,
drives.
I use Freud to explain Nietzsche, that Freud had this notion of sublimation. Actually, I use Nietzsche to explain Freud because Freud had a lot of trouble explaining sublimation. But Nietzsche's explanation of sublimation is, look, most of us are made up of drives that put us in multiple directions. You know, you've got your sex drive, you've got your intellectual drive, all different kinds of drives, and they push you in multiple directions. Like your entertainment drive might drive you to be obsessed with getting a big TV. Your intellectual drive might lead you to being obsessed with getting a good interpretation of Nietzsche. What have those drives got to do with each other? Nietzsche says most of us are just a jumble of drives. At one moment this drive's in ascendance, next moment that's drive in ascendance. But there are certain great individuals like a Goethe or a Beethoven or a Nietzsche who have a master drive, and it harnesses all the other drives towards its aim. That's his notion of sublimation.
Nietzsche takes quite a bit, obviously, from Schopenhauer. What I also want to ask you is, how is the will to power different from Schopenhauer's metaphysics of the will?
Yeah, I'm not one of those interpreters who put a lot of emphasis on the will to power.
Yeah.
You know, Nietzsche had the moments when he said he's suspicious of those who want to be unriddler of the universe, and he had his unriddling moments. And so in the 19th century, people were looking for a monistic explanation. It was very, very common. It was a mind-body problem. They were looking for something that could unify everything. I think will to power was his kind of stab at it, most of which he had a good taste to leave in his notebooks. I mean, there are some philosophers like John Richardson, like Heidegger, like Bernard Reginster, who really want to make will to power basic. But I take a lot of solace from most of the will to power stuff is in his unpublished notes. It makes it occasionally. It's mentioned in Genealogy of Morals and Beyond Good and Evil. But I don't think it's a very interesting part of Nietzsche. I think it's him as a would-be 19th century. It puts him in his milieu as a 19th century thinker. And I think a lot of his thoughts about the problem of meaning, his thoughts about creativity, can be hived off from his thoughts about the will to power.
His diagnosis then of nihilism, or the lack of meaning, the uncanniest guest, I think he refers to, of Europe, and also, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on Nietzsche on Christianity, how he believes that Christianity was, on the one hand, a necessary poison, perhaps. I think he puts it like that.
Well, it gave us depth, as he said. Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition gave us unheard of depth.
And the relationship, though, of Christianity, and at least in Nietzsche's understanding of it, and nihilism, and how nihilism is the history of the next 200 years.
Nietzsche actually admires Christianity.
Yeah.
Because Christianity actually, for 2,000 years, as he says, warded off suicidal nihilism. I think that's a way exaggeration, but because I don't know, I think humans...
It was a bulwark against nihilism, he says.
It's a bulwark, but is it really suicidal? I mean, we humans have been evolutionarily programmed to seek survival, so we didn't really have to ward off suicide. Suicide is an aberration for us. It's not the norm. But the point Nietzsche is making is that for 2,000 years, Christianity gave life existential meaning. It had a story about how the whole had meaning. And he respects its impetus to give meaning to the whole. He's got two complaints about it. One people know about. One is the complaint that Christianity creates meaning, according to Nietzsche, by belittling this world and saying this world isn't the real world. The real world is the world to come.
Yeah.
Right? So he says that shows a kind of hatred of this world, or wanting to escape this world.
Yeah. He
says Christianity was invented by weak people who felt they had no efficacy in this world, so they fantasized an alternative world where they would be among the kingdom of the righteous. They would be rewarded. They would be on high, and those who are high now would be down low. So he says it's a fantasy, it's a revenge against this world, and it shows a hatred of this world. Whereas Nietzsche said we need to learn to affirm this world. That's the part of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity that I think most people know, who know anything about Nietzsche. But the other thing people need to realize about Nietzsche, he's kind of, he's against Christianity because it no longer works. He's writing in the Europe of the 19th century where it just doesn't grip us anymore. Look, there are plenty of Christians around, but the educated we're getting more and more secular. And he saw that trajectory. So he said, what do you think? He said, look, and this is a mark of respect. He said, all great things bring about their own end. And he says in the Genealogy of Morals, in the third essay around section 28, I think, he said, it was Christianity's will to truth that ends up pronouncing, and there is no God. So Christianity, through its will to truth, kills itself. All great things kill themselves, but that's an acknowledgement that Christianity is a great thing. So part of his objection to Christianity is it's no longer a living thing for us. It can no longer give us meaning. I mean, that is why, a lot of people have said God is dead, as Nietzsche said. But what he was really getting at is what we're going to experience is the real death of God, that God was a means of imbuing the world with meaning. And there are a lot of secular people who continue on with that meaning, like the meaning of compassion. For instance, God says, the golden rule, love your neighbor as you love yourself. It teaches us compassion. Now, there are a lot of secular people, humanist people, enlightenment people, who continue on the morality of Christianity without the metaphysics. They don't believe in God. But Nietzsche says the next 200 years, they're going to say, well, if there is no God, why should I care about the suffering of my fellow man? Why should I be so-called moral? And that would be the nihilism. That's a kind of nihilism that Dostoevsky talked about, when you lose all grip on existential meaning.
Everything is permitted, becomes permissible.
Well, that's Dostoevsky said that.
Do you think that the second
everything is permitted? But actually, he got that wrong, because who's doing the permitting? Nothing is permitted, nothing is forbidden. Because there's no authority there.
Do you think that there is in Nietzsche a genuine response to nihilism, or is it just a diagnosis? Does he go beyond it? Does he project something what might come after?
Okay, this is a great question. This is why Nietzsche is a real disappointment in many ways. He's a great diagnostician of the problem of modernity, a clash between our need for meaning and our will to truth, which evacuates the world of meaning and leads to what I call the disenchanted world, following Weber. But how good is he constructing a meaning, right? He's constructed a meaning for himself. He thinks, what is important on the earth is the great individuals and high culture. But that just seems, it can't help but seem to a certain extent arbitrary. Because you say, well, that's what you find meaningful. But you don't get the normativity. The thing about communism or Christianity is to have a normative element.
And it's messianic. There's a messianic element. It's prophetic. It's a full ideology.
It's an ideology that projects into the future. Exactly.
Even,
But you get this descriptive point that these are what Nietzsche values, but there's no normative force to it. There's no argument to say why it should be valuable. Why should it be valuable? Why should high culture and great individuals be valuable to others? There's no normativity coming out of Nietzsche. He may have felt the pull of those aims, but he can't explain why they should be aims for others. And he doesn't give us a politics too.
No.
I mean, actually, recently I've been very turned off by Nietzsche. We're heading into an anti-democratic age now.
Post-liberalism, they call it, yes.
And it could be much worse than post-liberalism. We'll see. We've had Brexit, we've had Trump, and we might have another dose of Trump. But we've also got Orban and Erdogan and Modi, all these anti-democratic forces. And now that democracy is ebbing, democracy doesn't seem so bad to us. And but we have nostalgia for it anyhow, some of us do. And Nietzsche is one of the great anti-democratic thinkers. And that's because he's part of this 19th century group. I mean, there's Tocqueville with Tyranny of Majority, but there was also Burckhardt. Was it Burckhardt or Bachofen? Bachofen has said, because I value freedom, I hate democracy. Which to our ears sounds very funny. But, the 19th century, they thought democracy is just going to lead to literally mob rule. You'll have the Trumps, you'll have the demagogues taking over. And they also thought it would lead to the institution of the mediocre as the norm. They were really worrying about a coming age of mediocrity. But I just don't see it. I think liberal democratic societies give a lot of freedom for these so-called geniuses to arise. Supposing I don't give a shit about the Sun and Bonum, I don't care about other welfare. Supposing I have Nietzsche's values, and all I care about are great individuals and high culture. What's better than liberal democracy to foster great individuals? Sure, a lot of people just care about football and care about low culture. They institute that norm. But Nietzsche said these geniuses are lucky accidents. They're freaks of nature. They're pushed by their inner demon. So even if there's an atmosphere of mediocrity, these people will just ignore it and pursue their own creative ends. And the democratic liberal world gives more people freedom to pursue their creative ends. I mean, who had more geniuses in the 20th century? Autocratic Russia, whether it be under the czars of the communists, or liberal, so-called liberal democratic America. I think the Americans went hand down on that one.
There are a few strange passages actually in Zarathustra that I'm just thinking of now. For example, he values the great individual, the lonely individual, above everything else. But he also says that at some point, from you lonely lot, if you just withstand that loneliness, paraphrasing him a bit, you shall become the chosen people. He almost uses that, so he speaks of the Auserwählten. I don't know if you have this
Don't
message.
remember it.
On the other hand, so he's very critical of the state, as you know, in Zarathustra, almost sounds libertarian, or proto-libertarian, you could say. But overall, I think, yes, I would agree that he doesn't, he shows us, he points us to everything what's wrong or we're suffering from, but then the hope is just that the Overman as a lightning flash arrives, or that the higher human being leads to the Übermensch or Overman. No, yeah.
I think what Nietzsche really cared about is inspiring other potential geniuses. So he didn't really care that much about, look, he wanted to be successful, he was ambitious, so he didn't want professors to write books about him. But his real hope, and the hope that Nietzsche, the character, should care about, the character he created, his real persona, despite the flesh and blood man maybe wanted to be written about by professors, but the persona he creates doesn't really care about the professors. He cares about other geniuses. And the fact is he was remarkably successful in inspiring a lot of, people like D.H. Lawrence, people like Hermann Hesse, people like Thomas Mann, people like the architect Courvoisier, E.M. Foster even. They're extremely, not that I like E.M. Foster, I don't even like Lawrence for that matter. They were extremely inspired by Nietzsche to find their own creative voice. And he does say that. He says, I write for very few. So I think by his own lights, he was very successful. But he was successful not because he gave them a doctrine, because he inspired them to find their own voices. Because he inspired them to think, I don't need to be weighed down by conventional morality. Nietzsche says conventional morality is fine for members of the herd.
Yes.
But the conventional morality aspires to be a universal morality. It wants to suck everyone into it. And Nietzsche wants to say, no, it's very elitist. You talented people, you pursue your own ends.
Yes.
You make your own morality.
So on that reading of Nietzsche, it would almost be best to have the herd keep its basically Christian morality even without God, while the great individuals keep on pursuing their creative projects
He literally says
that might lead to, I don't know, a religion of art perhaps at some point in the future.
He does say that. He says, let the rules of the herd rule in the herd.
Yeah.
It's very elitist and very condescending thing to say. And he also says, look, I respect Christianity because it gives meaning to a lot of very poor, benighted people who have terrible lives. And their lives, this is horrible of him, he said, they need to be terrible. Because Nietzsche thinks there needs to be an underclass doing the shit work. There's a great composer, Wagner, who writes his masterpiece and then goes to the opera house to perform it. Well, there has to be some drone who drives him to the opera house.
Sure.
And some drones who are putting the people in the audience and ushers who are putting them in the seats. It's an incredibly condescending view, but that's Nietzsche's view.
But there must also be, an audience for Wagner.
Yes,
If there isn't one, because that's one of the disappointments of Nietzsche, that he comes to Bayreuth and realizes this is just another bourgeois entertainment machine that doesn't lead to the birth of a Dionysian new age or religion of art where new divinities arrive, if you want to even go that far. I don't know. So there needs to be an audience for it. I mean, even he must have thought there is an audience, if only posthumously, as we know, his readers are born.
Well, okay, so there's a question. Who are his readers? Am I a reader? Or are the readers, really people like Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse, truly creative people?
But even they need readership. So I wonder, is there not also a social dimension or a dimension of community? Or?
There's part of, sometimes he talks about just, it's the peaks talking to the peaks.
Yeah.
People like us were in the valleys and they're the peaks. But is it really just the peaks talking to the peaks? That I think that's an exaggeration. I think he cares mainly about the peaks, but he wants people, an audience of people who aren't necessarily the peaks, but can also be inspired. And also it's those people who help the peaks live on. It's your point. The peaks need an audience. The peaks need people to sing their praises. The gods need people to sing their praises, right? I mean, there are some people who are only singing the praises of Messi. That's the vast majority of people out there. And then there are some of us who are singing the praises of Nietzsche and Goethe and Wagner, etc. And those are needed too by Nietzsche's lights, I think.
There's a passage in Nietzsche where, I think this is in Der Wanderer und sein Schatten, the wanderer and his shadow. Well, I'm paraphrasing now from memory. I think Nietzsche says something that there is the possibility of a highest state in the future when Europe is contained in 30 books and all Europeans have disappeared.
Really? He says that? I don't remember that at all. All Europeans have disappeared.
This is
because other times he talks wanting to be about a good European.
Yes. Maybe we can talk about Europe and Nietzsche's idea for, I guess, a pan-Europeanism or whatever the word might be, I don't know, or a greater Europe as well, given that you brought up Brexit. But yeah, this, I don't know if that's,
no,
that's a quote I...
doesn't ring a bell to me at all, but I wonder what he was getting about that, about, what did he say, overcoming Europeans? Or? Well,
it's basically, I'm paraphrasing now, but there will be 30 books or so that contain the European spirit. And that'll be good enough. All of Europe, everything else can disappear.
No bloody idea what he's talking about.
That just came to mind because it's the peaks talking to each other, so maybe that's where this kind of thinking leads to ultimately. All the necessary 30 books without even the readership for them.
Yeah, but the general trajectory, all the emphasis about becoming over being is you just want more and more peaks. There's a set number of peaks. That seems a very un-Nietzschean thought.
Okay, yeah, well, that's when pure becoming ends, then perhaps it must. Well, Heidegger picks up on this passage in the Anaximander essay that he, but on the other point, though, the question for Nietzsche's understanding of Europe, he was obviously opposed. In the end, he even stylized himself, he didn't even want to be German anymore. He maybe it's true, I don't know, but he
Polish ancestry and all that bullshit.
He's a Nietzsche. Nietzsche is a Polish
aristocratic name. He was embarrassed by anti-Semitism. He was embarrassed by German nationalism, which at that time were extremely connected. He was generally embarrassed by nationalism in general. It's again, he's a 19th century man writing in an age where the nation state becomes supreme, and he just sees that as a new god. And pathetic God, not even less interesting than the Christian God.
Do you have any thoughts on what Nietzsche has to say on Europe?
I think his praise of Europe is basically a reactive movement against the nationalisms. And he thought the nationalisms, Deutschland über alles, is just another low culture move. That nationalism gets, it's like following a football team for him. It can get, very self-involved and not a high level of creativity going on there. So he just, he talks about a greater Europe not because he's got a strong commitment to it so much as he's got a strong commitment against petty divisive nationalism.
So it's a reactionary
I think it's
move against
I think it's very well
petty
thought
nationalism.
out. Yeah.
But
He doesn't write a lot about it. There are a few asides, and you can see it's mainly in the context of combating nationalism, combating anti-Semitism, stuff like that.
So even there, you wouldn't see a vision that he has for.
No, I don't think he
future.
has a big vision. That's the problem with Nietzsche. You don't get much of a vision of what the future is. We know what he values. He values great individuals, geniuses, and high culture. He gives us no sense of what kind of society he thinks could foster these geniuses. And we've got a good reason why. He says they're strokes, I kind of agree with him, they're strokes of luck. If they're strokes of luck, there's no recipe.
Yeah.
So you don't get an idea of a political solution, a political form that he would endorse, because what society really leads to the generation of geniuses? Who knows?
And
He certainly doesn't know.
now coming to Wagner, the maybe personal aspects aside, why do you think there's a falling out? And in the end, he blames Wagner for having bowed to the cross again.
Yeah, that stuff that he became Christian again.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it's what Harold Bloom talks about, anxiety of influence. You know, these super creative guys end up killing their fathers, right? You know, what he owed to Wagner, which he didn't get from Schopenhauer, because everyone talks about Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. Yeah, Schopenhauer, the problem of suffering. But what wasn't a problem for Schopenhauer was the problem of meaning, not the way it was for Wagner. Because Wagner really was influenced by the German Romantics to see that modernity is faced with this clash between our will to truth, which destroys all mythology, and our need for mythology to, as I said previously, enchant the world.
Yes.
And that problematic Nietzsche got from Wagner, and he owes it to Wagner. And in that sense, he's just as much a disciple of Wagner as he is of Schopenhauer. But, you know, he puts Wagner down by saying he lapsed into Christianity, that he fell back. But still, the problematic he's working in owes a lot to Wagner. As I say, you know, one needs to kill one's father.
This is perhaps now a bit left field, but do you see an opening for myth or mythology, for new myth or mythology, or maybe even the danger of a new mythology?
Well, we're living in a post-truth age, and you know, Nietzsche was right. The will to truth and the need for myth clash, and now we're seeing it. And now the will to truth doesn't look so bad when we're looking at but the myths people create today are just so awful. You know, they're crazy conspiracy theories. Here's a myth that the Democrats need children's blood. You know, crazy mythology.
You may be aware of the phenomenon of QAnon.
Oh yeah, of
QAnon,
course.
QAnon,
Yeah.
QAnonymous, which started out on some
4chan.
online forum, which is just a messaging board of endless messages. There's nothing I think else on it, and it was some entity which I know named Q,
Who claimed to be a government official.
Yes, and it was basically random drops that had no meaning whatsoever. And but one of it was picked out, and if you remember when there was the storming of the Capitol a few years ago, on January 6th, the lady, I forgot her name, who was shot, actually quoted Q almost as a prophet. There was her last words apparently on her live stream, which is also a very random phenomenon that everything can now be live streamed. But I think the most important message of Q was actually a deeply Christian message. It's trust the plan. Trump is the Messiah. And to many people now in America, Donald Trump is a messianic figure. When you listen to some more of the radical evangelical preachers or so. And trust the plan. You know, don't do anything. Just wait for the second coming or for whatever. So Q, I think, worked on this base code of an overcome Christianity that has not been transvalued to come back to Nietzsche.
Well, I certainly think Q is, you know,
That it's bonkers is aside, but that's
yeah, it's a new mythology. For some people, it's a new mythology.
But it is.
It's a very poor mythology, and
it's cartoonish.
But it is cartoonish. I mean, people have short attention spans. And, hey, the Avengers films did fantastically for a while. And, the Star Wars. And Star Wars, Stephen Lucas actually read people like George Lucas, read people like Campbell.
He was actually a consultant to the first 3 films. Joseph Campbell, yes.
So Campbell was very influenced by German Romanticism, and he caught on to this idea, we need a new mythology. I find Star Wars, I've never been able to watch a Star Wars film from beginning to end. I find them so bad. But he was aware of the need to create a new mythology. Well, QAnon is a new mythology. And when you see these new mythologies, the will to truth doesn't look that bad anymore. Yeah.
Or even Wagner's operas, perhaps, some of them.
Well, Wagner very much was aware of creating a new mythology.
Yeah.
But he actually said, because our will to truth is so strong, we need a mythology that presents itself as mythology, not as the truth, not as the literal truth.
Yeah.
Of course, QAnon does try to present itself as the literal truth. Wagner thought...
But that's the Christian element of it, is it? That Christianity could be considered mythological.
Christianity presents
but Jesus Christ,
truth.
as you know, did walk the earth. And he was actually really dead for 3 days. And then he did rise from the dead.
Well, according to myth...
No.
Well, I'm an atheist, so I don't believe it.
I know, but if you're a good Christian...
No,
Christianity
was mythology. Christianity was mythology that presented itself as truth.
Exactly.
Right?
So that's why I see
that.
But
what Wagner says is, in modernity, we need mythologies that present itself as mythology.
As always, yes.
But actually, it turns out he was wrong, because QAnon and all those people, they present mythologies, but they claim to be the truth again.
Yes.
It's just like you're right. You said it's like Christianity.
Yeah.
Because what Wagner demands is almost impossible. If a mythology presents itself as mythology, how can it really animate us? If you tell yourself it's just a story, how can it be the center to your view of the world? How can it give you a moral space? That said, I know a lot of people who grew up watching Star Trek, and they knew Star Trek was a mythology, but it gave them a moral sensibility. So possibly story, you could say something is a story, and you can still get your morality sensibility from it. Look, a lot of people get their morality from reading literature.
Yeah.
And they know the stories are not true.
Yeah.
But for instance, Effie Briest, it's a German book by Fontana about a case of adultery. And at the time, adultery was considered, you're exiled from society. And the book is basically saying this is unfair, right? And everyone who reads it knows it's not literally true, but it was a book that, had a lot of effect. Or Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Turgenev's Sketches from a Hunter's Notebook. The Tsar read those. He knew they were just stories, but it gave him a new moral space. It allowed him to see that the serfs are actually humans and people.
Yeah.
So maybe we can get our morality from fictions.
So in a sense, we do that. It's just the question whether the myths that we have are any good. I mean, John Gray, for example, British philosopher, would claim or argues that progress, the belief in progress, is a myth, just not a very good myth.
And Nietzsche said the same thing too. He didn't believe in progress too.
Do you?
Progress to what? Look, there was for a long while post-war.
Yeah.
I was born in the 50s, late 50s. A lot of us felt very attracted to Enlightenment ideals. And Enlightenment idealism is, telling the Kantian story about the Cartesian story about the cone of light spreading, the light of reason spreading and taking more and more people in.
Yeah.
And it's like there's a switch. And some people have trouble getting the switch on, but once it's on, once you're in the light, you don't think of going out of the light. But now we have to tell a story. Was that really light? Is one story. Another story is, that was light, but it's dimming. So the enlightened story of progress is pretty hard to swallow now. I mean, it's all the story of, it was never progress, it was just colonialism and imperialism, etc.
Yeah.
That's one version. I'm not very sympathetic to that. I'm more worried about the idea that the Enlightenment was just a blip. that people are naturally
exception.
particularist,
Yeah.
they're irredentist, they're nationalist, they're against foreigners, and the Enlightenment was this little opening, and it goes against the grain of history, and now history is going back to the norm of nationalism, of hostility to foreigners, etc.
Back to, well, but even post-Enlightenment, we saw some of the greatest conflict, and even the French Revolution, born from the Enlightenment, contained within itself terror. I know I sound like Hegel now, and you hate it, but...
Yeah, look, it's a complicated story, but all I want to register for the moment is that post the Second World War in Europe, there were a lot of people who felt, oh, now Enlightenment ideals are going to come into fruition. But it's very hard to maintain that optimism. Even if you subscribe to Enlightenment ideals, it's hard to be optimistic that they're going to be realized in today's world. That post-war period where Enlightenment ideals seem to be flowering across Europe and across the world, that seems like an aberration now. We can end on the negative point about the Enlightenment.
So you would disagree with Adorno that there cannot be art after the Holocaust?
Well, he disagreed with that in the end because he used Paul Celan as a counterexample to his own thesis.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was just a smart-ass line and not very profound at that. Look, art will exist because there are artists, and and there are these creative geniuses, these strokes of luck, and I think we'll always have the strokes of luck. I can't see why we shouldn't or wouldn't. It's very hard for us to tell who the strokes of luck are because we're in the middle of it. Like next century, they might look back and say, all the novel was a 19th century, mid 20th century phenomenon. All the novels written today are rubbish. The real geniuses, maybe it's Francis Ford Coppola. They'll look back on film, the early days of film, and say, oh, these were the creative geniuses. So it's very hard. Every age says, oh, they look back and say, oh, all these geniuses in the 19th century. And the 19th century, they're saying, oh, there are all these geniuses in the 18th century. We don't have anyone. When you're in the midst of it, it's hard for you to pick up who really are the creative people. That's for posterity to judge. So, how do we begin on this? Adorno, that there can't be poetry. Maybe there can't be poetry because poetry had a lifespan. The novel may have had a lifespan. Film might have a lifespan.
Yeah.
Or maybe there are great poets now, but it's up to the future to tell us who they were.
Yeah.
We can't spot it.
Maybe what stories though would they have to tell us now? The great artists. What narrative would a poet have to relate, or what would a painter have to paint? Right now in 2024, in the 2020s.
Well, as I said,
I'm
not particularly sure that painters and novelists are going to be seen as the great artists of the 21st century.
Let's say filmmakers then, yeah. Well, whichever medium.
Well, filmmakers will look back on some of their stories and think they were absolutely fabulous stories, that they created a whole world. Maybe it'll be those Avengers films. I kind of doubt it. And Avengers, I just rewatched Avengers Endgame and Infinity Wars, and I very much like that because normally the baddies in all those films are just pantomimes. They're just stick figures.
Yeah.
It's all about the heroes.
Yeah.
But there was a baddie who actually had a name. He was an ecologist. He thought the world was overpopulated.
The universe was.
The universe was overpopulated, and he wanted to get rid of arbitrarily.
Thanos.
Wanted to get rid of 50%.
Yes.
He's called mad, etc., etc. But he was driven by a great idea. Now, could be a stupid idea, but could still be a great idea.
But it's a great idea, yes. So we have to be careful how people understand the word great. Okay.
Well, it can be great and stupid at the same time.
Yeah.
What I might mean is he was animated by an idea. Right?
Yeah.
And not a selfish idea. He wasn't doing it for his own sake or to get wealth or etc. He really believed it was the right thing to do. Now, people often believe something is the right thing to do, and it can be horrible, horrible things. Yeah. But it shows you the two-sided nature of idealism. That, you
Yes.
know, we can respect idealism, but horrible things can be done in the name of idealism.
Yes. Excellent. That's a wonderfully light note to end it on. I
Okay.
think, yeah. Horrible things can be done in the name of idealism. That's a good title.
Go, what's his name? Thanos?
Yes, Thanos, yes.
Go Thanos.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Your Highness. Nice to talk to you.
Danke. Das war sehr schön.